Hello there, John Coturillo here, the life coach of your listener. Thank you for joining me for this episode. Today, I'd like to have a brief discussion about one of the ways in which dangerous behaviours are involved in mental illness. Now, I'm a former paraprofessional therapist and social worker, so this was an issue that I addressed in my own work. However, this video is certainly not advice. If you have concerns about your own well-being or anybody else's well-being, do not take what you see on the internet as gospel. Seek the advice of a healthcare professional. But today I'd like to have a brief discussion because there seems to be a misconception in the discussion of mental illness that needs to be corrected, and it's that people with cognitive impairments, such as intellectual disabilities or higher tiers of autism, behave badly. And I'd like to clear this misconception because it's essential that we understand ideas accurately if we are to understand how the world works and how we can best help people. When we argue that somebody is behaving badly, it implies that that person is deliberately exhibiting those behaviors because they want to cause harm or because they are seeking to obtain some kind of unjustified or selfish benefit from it. To be clear, a person who is severely cognitively impaired and is exhibiting distressing behaviors is highly unlikely to be behaving badly. And I'm going to explain why that is. To start, all of us have basic needs, and we often don't consider what they are because we fulfill them without thinking. And those needs are for our biological welfare, to take care of ourselves, to be secure, and to be related to others. Often we fulfill these needs without thinking. We communicate with our friends and family. We groom ourselves and attend to personal hygiene. We eat, we drink. For most of us without disabilities, we can fulfill these needs without having to think. And that's why we often don't consider them to be of particular note, because we fulfill them seemingly without much cognitive effort. If somebody has a severe cognitive impairment, though, they may not be able to fulfill the needs as easily as we do, and they often require assistance to do so. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, we can argue that our bodies are designed to self-fulfill many of these needs. And if we can't fulfill these needs for ourselves, naturally we're going to encounter frustration. That frustration may be bad enough, but if we also can't communicate that we have those needs when we have them to somebody else, and therefore we can't get help fulfilling our very basic needs, the frustration simply multiplies. And that's why significant distress may show, and that's why a person in that situation who has such an impairment may exhibit behaviours that are distressing to themselves and distressing to others, such as self-harming behaviours or displays of anxiety or agitation. Many people also only think of these behaviours in terms of the distress that it causes any of the observers. Let me tell you again, if you're the person experiencing that impairment, then it'll be just as distressing for you. In fact, it could even be more distressing for the person experiencing the impairment because other people choose to ignore what's happening. If you're the person with unfulfilled needs, it's going to feel much worse. So for this reason, it's important to understand that in these instances in which a person with such a disability behaves that way, it's not bad behavior. It's not deliberately trying to cause any harm. It's that person trying to communicate, I have a need and it's not being fulfilled. It's essential that it gets fulfilled. Now, I'd also like to have a brief discussion of behavioural therapy approaches because there's some significant controversy about them and there are reasons for this, and I'm going to discuss why. Behavioural therapies work on the basis that how we choose our actions is based on the consequences of those particular choices. So if we choose an action and the consequences are desirable to us, then we may repeat that action in order to obtain the same consequences. If we choose an action and the consequences are undesirable, we may avoid that action in order to avoid the undesirable consequences. That's the basic theory behind behavioural therapies. And the reason that these are controversial is that in the past, behavioural therapies could be incredibly cruel. They often involve treating people who had disabilities such as the ones that I described in an inhumane manner and causing them aversive experience in order to discourage them from exhibiting bad behaviour. It's incredibly inhumane and should never have happened, and it should not continue to happen, even though in some places these types of therapies may be still used even in present day. However, not all behavioural therapies, to my knowledge, are like this. The fact is that even if we are completely able-minded and able-bodied, theories behind behaviourism are still relevant to human realities. we still make choices about our behaviours based on what the consequences are. Even if we don't think about it, that is still how the human mind operates. There are a selection of present-day behavioural therapies. Some of them are referred to as positive behavioural interventions. Instead of being conceptualised as discouraging bad behaviour by aversion, what they're actually focused on is educating on safe behaviours. And how that's often done is by teaching in a way appropriate to their capacity an individual that what they need can be obtained by behaviours that are not distressing to them and other people. And when it's done correctly, it doesn't involve aversion. Now, of course, there will always be examples of people not practicing these theories correctly, but there are different ways to integrate behavioural theory into the way that practitioners help people that are safe and that are not in any way aversive. Now, there are some counter-arguments to this, and one of them is that in certain positive behavioural interventions, in Australia, at least to my knowledge, there are instances of practitioners using what we call restrictive practices, which is any solution that limits how a person can practice their individual freedom. Now, yes, this is technically true. There are instances in which restrictive practices are used, and these could include locking cupboards that contain food or contain dangerous items. It could involve using forms of mechanical restraint. These are very heavily regulated under Australian law, and whenever a practitioner suggests this, when these interventions are practiced properly, it's as a last resort after every other solution has been tested and it's been found that there is absolutely nothing that can reasonably be done in certain situations to prevent harm to that person or another person without the use of a restrictive practice. And when this is implemented, it's also a legal requirement that the people implementing specify in written documentation how the practice is to be used, the maximum limit of time for which it can be used, and a plan for reducing and eventually eliminating the use of that restrictive practice if possible. It is very finely regulated, and for good reason. It's to prevent the abuse of human rights. Now, I'm not going to pretend that this doesn't have any risks involved, because there is always a risk involved when these types of treatments are implemented. But as someone who has worked in the industry, to the best of my knowledge, good practitioners do not treat it lightly. They use it only as a last resort, and they use them only to the minimal extent necessary if they do need to use them. Now, another argument that's been made against behavioural interventions is that they try to take neurodiverse people and make them normal. Now, again, this is a valid argument from some perspectives, because often there is still a lot of stigma around neurodiversity, and often people who are simply different are considered to be mentally ill simply because they don't conform to traditional standards. However, this type of diversity is not pathological. They actually are not objectively harmful in any way. They simply mean that the person works in a different way and might require a slightly different environment in order to flourish. In such instances, it would be inhumane to try and make people normal. However, arguably when interventions such as positive behaviour support are implemented, we're not simply trying to turn someone normal. The outcome often does result in a happier and less distressing life for the person involved. As I said, if somebody with an impairment, as described, is exhibiting distressing behaviours, it's usually because they're distressed. They're trying to communicate a need that they can't have fulfilled. If the result of the intervention is that person being less distressed and better able to fulfill their needs, then that is an objective good. It only becomes inhumane when practitioners become overbearing and start imposing their own opinions on what is normal and what is pathological. So thank you for joining me for this episode. As per usual, I am not engaged in professional health practice or behaviour therapy, so please, if you have concerns for your own welfare or the welfare of somebody else, please seek professional assistance. Do not take what you see on the internet as advice. I would also love to hear from my audience about their own experiences and opinions, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. I would love to have discussions with you and potentially have you on the program to discuss your ideas, and hopefully we can discuss ideas collaboratively and learn more about the world. Until next time, take care.